purpose of Catholic social teaching is to build a civilization of love. We're facing, the biggest political realignment in 100 years. The discontent is very serious. So work is not just a way to make a living. It's not just about the means of production. It's our way of expressing our participation in God's world. Pope Leo XIV, he is exactly the Pope we need for this moment. But we expect that he's going to address not only the issue of AI, but on the new thing now, which of course is a new industrial revolution.
Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. My name is Pier Paolo Finaldi. I'm the CEO and publisher of the CTS and your host for this podcast. It's my great pleasure and honour to welcome Jenny Sinclair to the podcast today. So Jenny is the founder and director of Together for the Common Good, a UK charity dedicated to civic and spiritual renewal informed by the Church's tradition of Catholic social teaching, and also the host of the Leaving Egypt podcast. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you. It's a real honour to be here. I'm excited to be in your new studio.
Yeah, welcome. Yeah, it's looking, we're very pleased with how it's come out. So I'm hoping that we have lots and lots of conversations here that will really help people grow in their faith. So, Jenny, do tell us a little bit about your own journey, because it's not often we have the daughter of an Anglican archbishop on a Catholic podcast. So tell us a bit about your journey from there to the current position promoting Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, so he was a bishop, not an archbishop.
Right, okay.
So don't elevate him too much. But yes, I grew up in East London and then in South East London, daughter of an Anglican vicar. He was a very famous Anglican vicar because he'd been a Test cricketer, in fact, a captain of England.
Wow.
In the 50s, and had a dramatic career change and gone into the church. But it was much later, in my late 40s, so we're talking about 2011 now, that I had what I now know is very clearly a movement of the Spirit, calling me into the work that I'm now doing. And at first, it was a sense of nagging. I don't know if you remember, there was the Tottenham riots around that time. There was the beginnings of a kind of social unrest. This is 3 years after the crash, the 2008 crash. And things didn't feel right to me. My instincts were telling me there's something not right in the culture. And so I was full of curiosity, and I was noticing that the churches didn't know how to respond. There was a very poor response from the church. And so I was drawn to looking at their partnership, or how did they do it? Because when their partnership was, and it was 22-year partnership, from the mid-70s to the mid-90s, at a time when Liverpool itself was going through a period of division, instability, high unemployment, social unrest, there was and sectarianism. There was a very serious situation going on there with very poor local leadership, and the bishops felt a very strong sense that they were being called to step into that space of a sort of informal community leaders. In fact, Archbishop Derek, who I got to know quite well before he died, he told me that he was given a double mandate when he was appointed to that see to prevent Liverpool becoming another Belfast and to work with the poor and unemployed. That was what he understood his mandate to be. And my father and he hadn't met before. What happened was we moved in 75, and Archbishop Derek was appointed 6 months after us. So there was an almost exact overlap of new bishops in both traditions, and they didn't know each other. And my father went round and rang the doorbell and went round to say hello and brought a bottle of wine and said, perhaps we should meet. And so they became firm friends. And they made a decision to act together in everything they could possibly do without breaking the rules. So they never took communion together, but they prayed together, and they found a great sense of trust. And they acted in civic society, around the great tragedies of, the Hillsborough disaster. In 96, people were killed in that football tragedy. They also acted together in the wake of the 1981 riots in Toxteth, where there was great tensions between the black community and the police. They knew both sides and they were trusted, and so they acted as mediators. They also helped to start Liverpool Hope University, many local institutions, a local housing association they helped to found. They enabled things that local people wanted.
So what was it that drew you towards this, essentially taking the Catholic social teaching and really sort of promoting that? What was the thing that sort of really...
Yeah, so in that year, in 2011, when I was starting to look at this, I started talking I just felt this compulsion to talk to people who had, first of all, who had worked with them, and then that extended. People would say, oh, you should speak to them, you should speak. So I had this kind of trail being set for me. And over a year, I spoke to about 100 people. And eventually someone said, Jenny, this is getting a bit big. Maybe you should start a steering group. It seems like it's a thing. So I didn't know anything how to do that. But people came around me and helped me. And one of those people was Tim Livesey, who used to be Rowan Williams' public affairs officer. He's a Catholic. And he introduced me to Catholic social teaching. I had been a Catholic since 1988 and nobody had mentioned it. So this tells you something about the formation that most people go through. They don't come into contact with it. Or if they do, it's just through CAFOD. You know, they think it's all about solidarity with the third world. Don't really understand the sophistication, the depth and the breadth. But Tim introduced me to that and I started reading. And I'm not an academic, so it was hard for me. And no wonder people find it difficult to access. You know, if you're not able to deal with quite dense documents, it's a challenge. And so inevitably it gets dumbed down, so people misunderstand it. But anyway, I was blown away. Rerum Novarum.
It has been talked about as the Church's best kept secret.
Too well kept.
Well, you know, hiding behind these Latin titles sometimes is, I would imagine, is a sort of barrier for entry.
It really is. In the English-speaking world, you know, it makes it very opaque to people. But particularly when I read Pope St. John Paul II's work, so Centesimus Annus and Laborum Exercens are incredible documents, and they are as relevant now as they ever were, and they speak to issues of political economy in particular, and they're so relevant for what's happening.
Let's give it a little kind of timeline, because it's interesting that those documents that John Paul II, in fact, a lot of the social documents have come out on anniversaries of kind of the original documents. So Centesimus Annus just means on the 100th year, but it's on the 100th year of what?
Of Rerum Novarum.
Okay.
So, let's go back to Rerum Novarum. So I'm discovering all these things at this time, and I'm beginning to see society through the lens of Catholic social teaching. So if we go back to 1891, in fact 1889, let's go back there. East London, the dock strike. The great dock strike is happening. So you imagine 10,000 men standing on the quayside waiting for work. Half get work, half don't. The ones that don't, their families starve that week. That's how it worked.
And this is in the greatest kind of naval centre of the world, isn't it?
Well, it's the height of the Industrial Revolution. And so Cardinal Manning is the Archbishop of Westminster at this time. And he's very close to his people, so he understands the impact on families.
Himself a convert as well, no?
Well, interesting. He had been an Anglican, and in fact he'd been married and tragically widowed, and then he'd converted. And interestingly, his father was a banker. So he understood what the new world, this new thing. So Rerum Novarum means of new things. The new thing was the Industrial Revolution at the time. And so he saw firsthand the impact of unfettered capital, shall we say, big money, on ordinary people. Because, of course, in those days, there was no unions, there was no good working conditions, the pay was terrible. So he found himself in a situation where he was witnessing tension between the workers and the companies that were employing them. And there was a strike called, a major strike. Large numbers of people were involved. And because he knew the people, it got to a point where he was invited to mediate because they trusted him and they knew that he would act on their behalf.
Because a lot of the dock workers would have been Catholics as well, wouldn't they? Irish dock.
Yes. So, to cut a long story short, he got involved and he helped to settle the dispute. And that led to better pay and conditions, and it was actually set the scene for what later became the union movement. The trades union movement came out of Catholic social teaching. So what's happening there is Cardinal Manning is applying his faith, his values, to a real scenario. But what he's also doing is he's feeding back information to the Vatican, and he's saying this is what's happening here. And of course, the Vatican, being global, is in a fantastic position to monitor what's happening all over the world. So they're getting similar stories coming from different parts where the Industrial Revolution is taking hold. And they're thinking, hold on, this is not good. This is impacting human beings.
And they're getting news from London, which was at the forefront of this particular kind of movement.
Yes. So then Leo XIII decides to write a piece about this, the first of the modern encyclicals, and he calls it Rerum Novarum of New Things. And really, it's a critique of unfettered capital and the defense of human labor. And the reason for this is that, the gospel, correctly understood, defends the integrity of the human being. And so that's really the hub, the nub of Catholic social teaching, is it gives us a framework to look at what's happening to the human being. And because our anthropology, as relational beings being made in the image of God, we're not made as isolated individuals. That's very important. We understand that relational element to our anthropology. The tradition also makes us look at what happens to relationships between people. So the impact on the family in particular, the impact on people's ability to participate in community, how these kinds of systems that are inhuman isolate people and make it more difficult for them to flourish. So this is really what the tradition is starting to do. So I'm discovering this at the same time and beginning to sort of look at what's happening in our culture. And I'm thinking the churches just aren't equipped with this. The Catholic Church had published a 1996 Common Good document, which was very good, but it didn't cascade down. It wasn't implemented. It was, a lot of these ideas were getting stuck at the academy. They were, worthy theological work, but they weren't being understood at a popular level. So I really saw there was a kind of, I'm not an entrepreneur. I wasn't looking for a niche. I was drawn into this. And around that time, we started a steering group, and we started looking at the Shepherd-Warlock partnership, and we looked at other partnerships, particularly Cardinal Manning and William Booth, who is the founder of the Salvation Army. They were friends in that time, and we began to see, what are the characteristics, the practices that make for a church that's really standing in solidarity with people and upholding the human person. So I realized, perhaps for some of your audience, this is sounding very social, compared with the life issues. So as time has gone on, we can explore this, but as time has gone on, I'm seeing that there's, unfortunately, a kind of almost a divide emerged in the church, where there are people in one camp who are focused on abortion and euthanasia and important issues like that. And on the other, you have people focusing on the social issues, like housing and poverty and so on. And they don't
arguing with each other about what's the most important.
They don't know each other. They use a different set of language. They perceive each other to be on different sides politically. There's a very unfortunate estrangement. And I feel that it needs to be a bridge across, because what we need to do is to tell a holistic story about what it means to be a human being. And now we're in 2026, where we're now anticipating the first encyclical of Pope Leo XIV, and we understand that he chose his name particularly to echo his predecessor of Leo XIII from 1891. So we're expecting a new encyclical on the new thing now, which of course is a new industrial revolution.
So we'll come back to that. But I wanted to maybe just explore a little bit the content of Rerum Novarum, which is available from CTS in printed form, and we've also put out an audio recording of it, which you can get from our YouTube channel. And it's a really quite remarkable document. not just because of what it started off, but also just the pure, the sort of prophetic witness that Pope Leo gives. Because I think one thing is that there was a sort of story that grew up around it, which was that it was, and I think each sort of era sees it in its own sort of responding to the particular problems of what's happening there. So, I think for me growing up in the 80s and 90s, people would say, it's, and especially because of the problems that were happening in Eastern Europe and the kind of preoccupations of John Paul II in particular, that it was a document that was against socialism. And it is very much against socialism. But the reason why I would say Pope Leo speaks about that is because he sees the problems of capitalism and says, be careful, this is not the answer. So do you want to just take us through a little bit the argument that he makes and a bit what he's sort of warning against?
Well, the way I interpret it is that, yes, he can see that Marxism in particular is putting forward a really powerful argument, a very cogent argument against capitalism. And he's thinking, well, what is the church's position on this? Because otherwise you can see the attraction of Marxism. So he begins to position Catholic teaching as a tradition that critiques any system that dehumanizes, whether capitalist.
Yeah, because obviously the
Marxist.
church is always very close to the people.
Yes.
And he's talking about what has happened to the working class in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. That's kind of where he begins. So we have a problem here.
Yeah.
The church, obviously he's speaking to everybody, but in particular the church sees the damage that it's doing to the poor and their families.
The difference is that Marxism is a materialist tradition, and the church regards the human being as a transcendent being.
Yeah.
And so we have a completely different conception of anthropology. And so that leads us into thinking about human labor in a different way. So work is not just a way to make a living. It's not just about the means of production.
Yeah.
It's our way of expressing our participation in God's world, which is a completely different way of seeing it. So it actually transforms our understanding of work. So again, that's very relevant now because we need to be focused on what does a dignified job look like. It's not just that it's well paid or has good conditions, but it's about fulfillment. It's about finding our place in the world. So I think he sets out that understanding of the human being as our participation and God's calling for us as a sense of vocation that's beginning to come through here, and that very much finds its way through John Paul's teaching as well. And I find that very powerful, that everybody has a vocational responsibility, that we're called into not just to act on our own behalf or for our own personal gain or salvation, but for the common good, that we have a contribution to make.
Because one of the things that I think he sees is that the real damage that the capitalist sort of the unfettered capitalism of the 19th century has on the family, the way that it exploits the individual, sort of working them to death, not giving them enough money to have a decent standard of living, of being able to buy property and things like that. And then he immediately goes in and he says, but if you think that the collectivism, the sort of state control of Marxism is the answer, he goes, be careful, because this is what's going to happen. And it's really incredible when you read it. It's like reading about the USSR, but 30 years before the October Revolution even happened. It's really quite extraordinary. And it's not a long document either, but it really packs a punch.
So this is really important, the word you used there, the unfettered.
Yeah.
Because that's a theme that keeps coming back. Capital, if it's not constrained, will act in a certain way which is extractive and exploitative. So, but the way to constrain it is not for the state to control everything. The way to constrain it is to have intermediary institutions, like to distribute power. So power is not centralized. So this is a theme that keeps coming back through subsequent encyclicals as well, but that's what we called subsidiarity, that responsibility is taken the closest to those that affects. So power should not be over-centralized. So this is the argument against the state taking too much power. The state has a role, an important role. It's not an argument for a small state either. There is an argument for interventionist state, but to allow capital to roam free is extremely dangerous, and the human beings become the victims. So this is the difference between Marxism. He's really warning against that collectivist ideal, which again we're seeing now. We're seeing young people now particularly attracted to the idea of a bigger state, thinking that that's a straightforward way of containing out-of-control capitalism, but it's not, because it ends up centralizing power.
So I'm obviously when Pope Leo took the name Leo, it was very clear from the beginning that he wanted to point again to the very important teaching of his namesake and predecessor, who was writing 140 years before. And yet I think we are at a point where the kinds of things that he was saying have become incredibly relevant. And again, so do you want to maybe just say something about why you think, what is it about the era that we're in now that has made this teaching so relevant again, so current?
Well, to do that, I think we need to roll back 45 years.
Okay.
In particular to 1979, when the neoliberal idea really took hold. I mean, we can take this back to the Enlightenment, really, but where it really went on steroids, was the Thatcher-Reagan moment. Mm-hmm. And we can see that sort of hyper-liberalism beginning in economic terms. Again, we're seeing capital allowed to roam free. We can also see it in social and moral terms, and I'd like to talk about those as a parallel, because they're two sides of the same coin. So this philosophy of liberalism, hyper-liberalism, there are different strains of liberalism. I don't want to make people think that we're against classical liberalism in all its forms, but this hyper-liberal idea of taking constraint off capital, in effect, it's taking us back to the 1890s, So what happens then through the 80s and 90s in the UK, at least, and in fact, all Western countries that have adopted this system, you see capital flight. So you see the offshoring of jobs to the Far East. Why? Because it's cheaper. Because in China, they have no worker protections. They don't have unions, much cheaper unit costs. So it's much more attractive for investors. And if you've got no constraint, there's nothing stopping them moving the money away. So what happens then? Well, we lose our manufacturing. So we have a deindustrialization period. And in an article in a newspaper, that doesn't look too bad. But if you're living in that kind of area, which we now call, post-industrial towns, the devastation is really very profound. So it's not only the loss of jobs, it's a loss of tradition, it's loss of community, it's loss of livelihood, loss of pride, loss of inheritance, of vocation, skill. All of these things are suddenly gone. So this is a consequence of that particular economic model. And so people need to realize, and I find the Catholic social teaching tradition is very helpful to understand what's happening there, because the human being, what's happening to the human being? The human being is losing that dignity of work. They're losing relationship, because through work you have relationships. They're losing, the opportunity to participate. So it's very profound what happens there. And then, so that's going on sort of 80s and 90s.
And sorry, and that it's not about GDP. It's not about, it's about people, and in particular, it's about families. Because this has an incredibly kind of corrosive effect on families themselves.
Well, let's take a detour then onto the families. I was actually talking with a working class pastor from Middlesbrough on Monday, because I'm going to interview him on the podcast soon. And he was talking, I was
So
talking...
Middlesbrough being one of these
post-industrial places. And I was saying, about the economy. And he said, it's not just the economy. That's a big loss. He said he told me his story that he grew up in an estate with obviously the loss of jobs and all of that going on, but also the culture changed too. So the culture has the hyper-liberal culture has an effect on the economy, but it also has an effect socially and morally. And what happened there was the enabling of single-parent families. He said it was much easier for women to have to manage on their own because the state was going to support them. So he was one of those kids. He had no dad. He grew up in a fatherless family. He got involved in drugs and trouble and violence and so on. And he actually attributes that to that system. I thought it was really interesting. Yeah. And so the undermining, the breakdown of the family actually is as a direct result of that system, because it's saying we don't need each other. We don't need man and woman. We don't need husband and wife. We don't need the family unit.
Well, it's the famous Thatcherite
there is no
saying,
society.
There is no such thing as society, only individuals. And I mean, Pope Leo would say absolutely not.
Well, this is it. This is what Catholic social teaching, as I say, the anthropology is so important, because if we understand that God made us as relational beings from the beginning, all the way through. For example, now, when the argument we've had recently on assisted suicide, you'll get people saying, well, it's none of your business. I can kill myself if I want. I can choose death if I want. This is absolute nonsense. The impact of somebody's death on everybody they know is profound. It's actually not true that you can take an autonomous decision that doesn't affect anybody, because everyone's born into relationships. So this economic model is one facet of that philosophy. The other facet is the moral unravelling. So the family is one very powerful element of it. But then, of course, as we've seen later, it leads to the unravelling of what it means to be a human being. So, I can now buy my way into a different gender. I can body modification. I can even outsource pregnancy. This is crazy now. We're getting to this is the consequence of that hyper-liberal philosophy.
And the kind of marketization of everything.
Well, the commodification of the human body itself. So we get markets in organs and, the idea of artificial wombs. And all of this sounds futuristic. It's already happening. So we've got to a point where this market idea has taken over our concept of what it means to be a human being. So, going back to Pope Leo XIV, he is exactly the Pope we need for this moment. It's just so wonderful how the Holy Spirit gives us the right Pope for the moment, and he has an intellectual ability. I think a sort of serious intellectual ability to get his head around this. Obviously, encyclicals aren't written just by the Pope. There's a lot of people working on it. But we expect that he's going to address not only the issue of AI, but these new industrial revolutions that are happening.
Yeah, so let's talk. So, in a sense, that kind of period of, as you said, sort of Thatcher-Reagan period, I think lays some sort of philosophical foundations, which then get kind of put into practice by sort of technological changes that we see. And I mean, if anything, this Pope Francis sort of famously said that we're not living in an era of change, but a change of era. And I can't help thinking that what he had in mind there was really a question of what has become possible through technology. And I mean, he does speak. He spoke very well about that. I think in about the sort of technocratic kind of paradigm. So now what would you say is causing this change of era, and why is it that has meant that we can kind of start using Pope Leo XIII's encyclical again in such a kind of in such a sort of clear way?
Well, if I can just go back to the change of era comment, I think he made that around about 2013-14, but I think it originally came from 2007, from the Latin American Bishops' Conference. I think that's where the idea was first floated. And it's very interesting it comes from South America, because I think from that vantage point, they can see how the effects are of capital gone wild is having an effect on the poor. But they're also beginning to see this shift in the perception of the human being. He's anticipating that already. I mean, Pope Francis always used to talk about culture of indifference, for example, and culture of encounter, these two ideas, which I think sometimes the language was too vague for people to really get their heads around what that actually means. But what he's talking about is a culture of individualism, which comes out of hyper-liberalism, where people literally don't care about their fellow citizens. So they're quite happy to walk along the street and ignore somebody sitting on the pavement. But they're also willing, for example, middle-class cultures happy to ignore the fact these post-industrial towns, people completely abandoned and left behind. Of course, until it starts to manifest itself in the politics, which it is now. That's why we're facing, the biggest political realignment in 100 years, because people are very, the discontent is very serious. So I think Pope Francis is seeing that. He's seeing the seeds of that. Even, around 2007, then 2008, the crash, and then no proper correction to the crash. Nobody went to jail. Nobody took the responsibility. And all the families that lost their homes, in the Western cultures who experienced that, there was no correction. So there's a sense there that there's a great injustice that's happened. But I think he's particularly seeing a change in the way people regard each other as human beings. There's a wonderful Italian Catholic economist called Luigi Bruni, who I know and admire his work very much, and he talks about the effects of this marketizing culture on the human being and the way we actually think. He said it actually rewires us. So the more we become used to, for example, sitting at home and ordering on Amazon, and the less we are borrowing and lending to our neighbor, that actually changes us, and we end up in a position where we don't need each other. And so we become indifferent. So I think that was what Pope Francis was sensing back then. And that's why he was arguing for this culture of encounter. Now, what he means by that is very similar to what Pope Benedict would be talking about, heart to heart. We need to reconnect, because the most fundamental thing is happening to us is that we're being made inhuman. The system is actually coaching us and schooling us to become consumers rather than participating relational beings, which is what we're made for. And this also, we were asking Sister Catherine of Siena to pray for us before we did this podcast, which is a really wonderful thing, because she had this beautiful way in her discernment of the mind of God that we are deliberately made by God to complement each other. So although within Catholic teaching we're seen as equal in the eyes of God, we're not meant to be the same. So this modern idea that we should all be equal is actually not consistent with a Catholic anthropology. We're deliberately designed to be constrained to serve each other. So again, this is what this culture of encounter is about. It's not about, for example, in our charity, it's not about giving, like being a service provider. It's about opening ourselves to the other. So relationships should be reciprocal. So you can begin to see how this is sort of forming an antidote to the culture of individualism.
Egalitarianism as well, in the sense that, we're all the same, which the church says, no, we really aren't.
Well, particularly men and women. Men and women are meant to be complementary. A proper understanding of the theology of the body. We understand that we are complementary. But this postmodern way of seeing the human being is actually dehumanizing. It's taking us away from that understanding of our distinct qualities and complementarity. So we're beginning to see now a really different worldview. So Catholic social teaching gives us this worldview, which is a way of understanding everything that starts with the human being. And fundamentally, it's about being relational.
I mean, it's interesting that, he began to see this sort of change of era happening at the end of the 2000s. I mean, we can say that maybe sort of social media which came in sort of 2015, more or less, was another sort of accelerant. And then we come to now AI, which seems to be the sort of the thing that really is causing, what has come to be called the sort of the new industrial revolution. Say something about that.
Well, it's actually 2010 is the turning point in terms of social media. Jonathan Haidt, the American psychologist, has done some really useful research on this, and he's actually tracked the particular apps and the particular development points in the app's development that makes people very addicted. And he can track what's happened to children who were engaging with particular apps around that time. And it does literally rewire our brains. So yes, this whole problem, which precedes 2010, as we've said, it goes back to 1979 of hyper-liberalism, is accelerated, as you said, with the arrival of the smartphone and then particular apps. So we're talking 2010, 2015. So we're already, even before they start, we're already suffering from this culture of indifference. We're losing the ability naturally to connect. And then, of course, the smartphone makes us all just basically looking at ourselves. As a cult of self, it becomes. The iPhone, the iPad, everything is devoted to my personal preferences. Religion as well is kind of privatized, so it becomes, part of my lifestyle. So the whole culture is changing from something that people participate in. Sense of mutual obligation starts to go. And then we get this dominance of rights. So it's no surprise then that out of this landscape, we then get identity politics. The whole identitarian idea of looking at a human being by category, so-called intersectionality, is actually a Marxist idea and profoundly dehumanizing and sets people against each other. It literally sets people against, it makes a hierarchy of victimhood. It turns the idea of, Catherine of Siena's idea of our being complementary, it turns us all into people that have an entitlement. And ironically, it ends up making the state more powerful because you get this battle of rights emerging.
And who's going to sort of arbitrate between all those
rights? The state has to arbitrate. So the state inadvertently becomes bigger. But at the same time, the state is becoming bigger because the neoliberal economic system develops poverty in all its forms. It generates requires low wages. Businesses actually lobby government to keep wages low, and that's the reason we had mass migration. It was actually an economic decision without any proper consideration of the impact on host communities. And of course now we get, unfortunately, tensions between host communities and incoming communities. And it's of no fault of theirs. It's mismanagement. But again, this comes from that philosophy.
Yeah. I mean, it was very interesting to see recently Pope Leo in I think it was in Cameroon, he was saying, first time I've really heard it sort of spoken of so clearly, to say that, maybe migration to the West is not the answer. In fact, it doesn't do any good also for the country from which these young men, who are probably the most energetic and entrepreneurial, that they should leave their country, also is bad for the country from which they leave.
Yes, I mean, the West ought to be helping those countries from which the men want to leave, to help them to become more stable and to develop more, healthier economies, and to persuade them to stay. We offer too many incentives in that sense. But looking at it through a Catholic social teaching lens, it's because it breaks families. I mean, I was in Australia last year, and I had to stop over in Doha, in Qatar, and I spoke to a lot of the workers there, and none of them were from that part of the world. They were all from, parts of Africa or Sri Lanka or India. And I said, do you miss home? And they were all missing home. I said, how many years have you been away? 7 years, 9 years, 12 years? But their families depend on their income now. So we've now developed this global economy, which is profoundly inhuman. It's breaking all those families. People are living isolated lives, thousands of miles away, and it's now baked into the system. So the whole thing is so dysfunctional. So I feel that the Catholic social teaching, if we see it in the round, from the before birth to a natural death, but everything in the middle, should also be our business. You know, how it undermines, how this system undermines humanity. And also bear in mind that it's actually stated in the social doctrine of the church that the purpose of Catholic social teaching is to build a civilization of love. It actually says that. So we have a constructive calling. And I think that's what Pope Leo XIV is going to be so helpful about, because he's going to resource us with ideas and practical ways of challenging this system, but also building something new. So strengthening the family, strengthening relationships, being intentional about making eye contact, stop using the smartphone in schools, for example. There've been so many things, but also noticing what's happening in this new industrial revolution. There's so much money to be made out of commodifying the human body, for example, and outsourcing our intelligence to AI. Now, this is the other area, which I'm sure we've all dabbled with chatbots. We're trying to figure out, you know, whether they're going to be any use to us or not. And you can feel that that desire. You know, you want some help. It's like having an assistant. It's quite tempting, isn't it? But then after a while, you think, hold on a minute. I'm not sure if I want to do this. You know, I want to think for myself. But you can see how it's very, very tempting for a young person who perhaps hasn't developed a wisdom. And the danger is you then start relying on it too much. And I hear stories from our work with schools, for example. You know, young people are confiding in chatbots now because they don't have a trusted adult that they want to talk to. They've learned to manage on their own. And they watch, you know, YouTube videos and consume information that way. And then if they've got a query, they'll go straight to ChatGPT. So what are we doing to the human being? So I think this is where Leo's going to go, because he's got a very profound understanding of what it means to be human.
I mean, it's been very interesting to see the sort of back and forth between Pope Leo and President Trump. I mean, that was really the question was about the war in Iran, and there was a sort of back and forth about just war theory, which sort of is part of Catholic social teaching as well. But I think the fundamental question that seemed to come up was that the church should not be speaking about things that happen in this kind of, you know, the political world, the real world, should we say. That we need to sort of stick to speaking about, I don't know, devotions or you know, things that are purely kind of spiritual. But you know, I'd love to hear, you know, why is it that we should listen to the church about these things?
Well, the church can resource people with a more sophisticated, more coherent, deeper way of understanding what's happening. I think without that, if we don't have that kind of metaphysical dimension to understanding what's happening in the world, if we're reduced to, I mean, politicians these days are not always that well read. I mean, it's actually very surprising that J.D. Vance supported that position, because he does know his Catholic social teaching.
Of all people, yeah.
So you would think he would at least, you know, welcome it. And I think he might retract that, you know, at some point, because I think he'll welcome what Pope Leo has to say about AI, for example.
I mean, one question I'm just very interested in, you know, as looking around at the politics that we have today, it would seem that the church is a bit of a voice in the wilderness. So how can we take these ideas of social teaching and, you know, incarnate them in our own society? I mean, presumably that's the very work that you're trying to do. But what's the sort of methodology for that to happen?
Well, first of all, about our politics, what's happened to our political parties is very interesting. It's terrible, but it's interesting. You know, the Labour Party came out of the Catholic and Methodist tradition, and the Conservative Party also came out of Christian roots, but both have been colonised by this hyper-liberal idea. So both have completely lost their original purpose. The Conservative no longer conserves, and the Labour Party no longer defends Labour. You know, in fact, I think a recent survey showed that the people that are most likely to support the Labour Party are people who've been private school educated. So there's been huge mission drift. That's the first thing. So Catholic social teaching has this great position and a non-partisan position. So we're radical but also conservative. We're conservative in terms of the family, relationships, the understanding of the human being and so on. But we're also quite radical in terms of the economy. So we have this preferential option for the poor, so we don't abandon people. So, for example, that offshoring of jobs, we wouldn't just have abandoned people and left them with no correction for 40 years. You know, you would incentivize investment, and you would rebuild, and you would retrain, and you would reinvest, for example. But this framework that we're looking for now, I would say the simplest thing to remember is that Catholic social teaching always asks us to look at what is happening to the human person. So one of the things I've been doing in my work, we have several strands to our work, but one of them is I hold public talks. I invite leading thinkers and practitioners to come and speak, and I invite leaders across the Christian traditions. So I'm not just engaging with Catholics. I'm trying to bring Catholic social teaching to all Christians, because I think it's too good to hide. It's too good, you know, it's been kept a secret for too long. And by the way, when my father and Archbishop Warlock were, you know, in their heyday, as it were, I think it was Clifford Longley that wrote in the biography of Warlock that my father had basically said to Archbishop Derek, "You've got a gift that we need, that the country needs. Stop giving it to yourself." And I think that's a really important message now. I think the country needs the Catholic tradition, including the Catholic social teaching. So one of the things I've been doing is inviting people to speak. So we've bring someone to speak about, say, assisted suicide from a Catholic social teaching position. You know, let's understand really what's happened and what are the arguments. Also, we've addressed what does it mean to be a person in the age of AI. So we're looking at personhood from a Catholic and Christian position. I've also held events looking at statecraft, what would need to change to our way of understanding our political economy. So I think,
you know, as you say, what we need in all of those is well read, kind of formed Christians.
People, yes. Yeah. So in these talks, when I'm inviting, you know, leading thinkers, practitioners, I tend to choose people who are really doing it in the world rather than just thinking about it. I'm helping people to understand what these things look like in practice. So what would this civilization of love look like in terms of political economy? What would it look like, you know, when we approach a critical issue like assisted suicide? Or my next event next month is on AI and the future of work. So I'm hopefully helping to, I'm bringing over Matthew Sanders from Rome to help people get their heads around something that I think a lot of people think is specialist and they don't need to think about, but actually it's going to affect everybody. And it may well...
It is hurtling down the track.
It really is.
At all of us, I think.
And I think when people get their heads around the disruption it's going to cause, you know, it may end up good, but most people are very cautious about it. And the disruption to jobs could be actually catastrophic, and we anticipate there could be social unrest, you know, down the track if it's not handled right. For example, if you think of a care worker, a social care worker, so she's at the bottom of the tree, she's paid the lowest, she has to help, you know, elderly people at home in these, you know, really tightly constrained time slots, maybe 15 minutes she's got to help maybe get that person dressed, give them a cup of tea, and she's got no time to be relational, and that person is lonely and needs time and so on. So that's quite a dehumanizing job, and it's low paid. So how could AI potentially enable her to become more human, more relational, take some of the administrative burden off her? So there are ways of looking at this that could be positive, but also at the same time, if you're a local council and your budget is very constrained and you're being offered products from the Chinese, which are already like robots are looking after the elderly in China already. You know, this is going to come down the track pretty quick, and it's going to look cheaper to buy robots to care for the elderly than it is to have human beings. Now, this sounds dystopian and almost science fiction, but it's already happening. And so these kinds of choices that people are going to face, you know, if they're in positions of decision-making ability, I want to help people, equip them with an ethical framework that's rooted in the gospel, which is what Catholic social teaching does. It's the most sophisticated, coherent theological framework that we have. And not enough people are aware of it. Or if they are, it becomes too rarefied and it's difficult to apply.
So tell us, where can people find out more about the work that you're doing and sort of get in touch with that process that you're putting into in action?
So people can find us at t4cg.substack.com, and that part of our work is there, so they'll see recordings of all those talks and texts from all those talks. We also publish articles and leading thinkers around these kinds of issues. We also have a schools program called Common Good Schools. That's commongoodschools.co.uk. So we're currently working with schools around the country, primary and secondary. And we have a 10-week program that we train teachers to deliver themselves in school. And that actually helps young people discover the basic principles of Catholic social teaching, like we've been talking about, but critically to implement them in the local. So very much in the neighbourhood, and helps to position the school as a force for the common good in the neighbourhood. And the other thing that I do is I have a podcast I co-host with a colleague in Vancouver. So it's a transatlantic podcast, and that's called Leaving Egypt. And the reason we call it that, if people can guess why, but if you think of the modernity that we're talking about, which is so inhuman, how do we leave it mentally and metaphysically, but continue to live in it? Because I do believe we're called to live in it and not to exclude ourselves. Very much in a Jeremiah 29:7, seek the welfare of the city, and in its welfare you will find yours. So I think that's very, very powerful guide to be outward facing. So on that podcast, we invite leading thinkers to help us read the signs of the times. And we also invite grassroots Christians, all denominations, to tell stories about how they're sensing the Holy Spirit is moving in their lives. We track, for example, how the church is changing, the different expressions of Christianity, what's happening, how young people are becoming attracted to particular traditions and what's happening in different parts of the world. So I love doing that. It's fascinating, meet such interesting people. And I also get asked to speak to clergy and lay people and leaders and so on. So yeah, we're doing a number of things.
Very well. We'll put all that in the show notes.
Thank you.
People can follow that.
Yeah.
Well, Jenny, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I think I can think of at least 3 or 4 different subjects that I would love to sort of do a greater, deeper dive into that. And when Pope Leo does come out with his Encyclical, I think it'd be great to get you in to talk about that once we've all digested it a bit.
Yeah, it's very exciting. As you said, is it 135 years, I think, this year since Rerum Novarum. So that's a long time. And it's hard for people to get their heads around the idea that we are actually facing a new industrial revolution. Because if it hasn't impacted on you immediately yet, you can't really imagine it. But I think we do need to get our heads around this.
I'm reading it together with our men's group, and we are finding it an absolute breath of fresh air, and there's so many interesting discussions that have come out of it, and it's amazing how it immediately begs a sort of reaction, a practical reaction from us. There's all sorts of things where we're sort of trying to help each other, and
that's why I love the phrase vocational responsibility, because we all have a calling, we all have a responsibility to engage with the other. But also it acts as an antidote to this culture of individualism where rights have become too dominant. So Catholic social teaching is always looking for balance. I should have said this earlier, but balance between labour and capital, for example, between rights and responsibilities. This is really important. So we've become so overbalanced with the culture of rights, as we talked about earlier, that's why we do now need to pay attention to our responsibilities, to each other, and indeed how God is calling each of us. We're all given gifts and abilities. We all have something to give. Even the most profoundly disabled person has something to give. So each of us is called.
It's been a great pleasure to speak with you, and I do hope you'll come back.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. An honour. Thank you so much.
Thank you.